Hey everybody, this is Fran from the 5-Minute Modeler, and today we're going to talk about what might be the best scale in model railroading. No, I'm just kidding. But this might seem controversial to some, but to be clear, best is subjective, right? And I'm not trying to convince anyone to go to N scale. I do have a bias there. I've been in that for a long time. But yeah, that's a decision each modeler needs to make based on their desires and space and so forth. But let's look back historically. Prior to the 1960s, O scale was the predominant scale of model railroaders. From the 1960s on, HO scale grew in popularity. Why did this occur? Well, there were several reasons. The quality of HO equipment improved significantly, including more realistic 2-rail versus Lionel with its 3-rail system. Modelers could fit a lot more railroad into the same space using HO. HO train sets were marketed to that generation of kids growing up in the 60s and 70s. These train sets hooked the kids into the hobby. The cost of HO equipment was significantly less expensive. More use of plastic rather than metal, as well as imports from Europe and Japan, helped drive the cost down. The quantity and variety of HO equipment grew during this time as well, and unfortunately Father Time caught up with many O-scalers, leaving model railroading to the next generation. That transition took over 30 or 40 years or so. N-scale didn't really appear until the 1960s, although the quality of the equipment then left much to be desired for most serious modelers. It didn't gather much steam until the 1970s when some of the major manufacturers of HO equipment started to import N-scale trains. Atlas, Bachmann, Lifelike, and others all began creating new models including locomotives, cars, track, building kits, and train sets. The advantage seen by many people was the size of the models allowed for modeling in smaller spaces than required by HO or O scale, and in many cases the prices were lower. Are you starting to see a pattern here? So HO has been the go-to scale for most scale modelers for the past 50 to 60 years. However, N-scale continually grows in popularity to where there are now separate N-scale conventions, manufacturers that specialize primarily in N-scale, magazines and websites, and retail merchants all devoted to N-scale equipment and supplies. Additionally, the quality of the equipment has improved exponentially, especially since the 1980s. At that time, Atlas imported the Elco RS3 locomotive, which they had contracted with Kato to make. And this locomotive used a new split frame design. It had a better motor along with finer detailing and set the standard for years along with continual improvements to provide smoother running along with great pulling power, equal or sometimes better than HO equipment. As I see it, the evolution of model railroading continues. We see more modelers either move to N-scale or start their model railroading efforts in that scale. Many of the drivers in the switch from HO to N are similar to what drove the transition from O to HO. All that said, as an avid N-scaler for the past 40 years and an HO scaler before that, I'd like to talk about the advantages that I see in N-scale. So the top advantages, the number one is probably space efficiency. You just can get a lot more railroad into the same space. HO scale is about half the size of O scale, and N scale is about half the size of HO. Not exactly, but close. This ability to fit more railroad into a smaller space appeals to many modelers who lack large spaces for a basement-sized layout. For the modeler with the spare room or basement, a large N-scale layout allows them to run trains of 30, 40, 50 cars or more and not overpower the scenes. Smaller shelf-style layouts can be built with great scenery and more realistic operations in smaller spaces. Secondly, N-scale is pretty cost-effective. While you can always spend as much as you want on model railroading, N-scale tends to be less expensive both for new and used equipment than its HO brother. For example, I searched an online merchant in the Midwest, US for locomotive prices. In HO, new locomotives from one specific mid-priced manufacturer, so these aren't the top of the line, they're not the bottom of the line, but mid-priced, were available from $114 to $234 US. In N-scale, locomotives ran from between $80 to $190 for the same manufacturer. It was about 18% lower than an HO. It bears mentioning that locomotives today generally are significantly better detailed and smoother running than those from the 70s through the 90s. The addition of sound has also increased the price of some models. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. In the past, though, the variety and availability of specific models and road names was an issue in N-scale, particularly with locomotives. The other thing was the older locomotives sometimes weren't made to scale. They were made to fit the engine, the locomotive motor, and so forth. And so sometimes they were bigger than the actual prototypes. But this is somewhat of an issue still somewhat of an issue because most manufacturers create a limited run of specific locomotives and cars, and once those are distributed to hobby shops and first-time buyers, they become more difficult to find as brand new. Many retailers offer waiting lists for modelers wanting specific models and road names, and that said, there are significantly more options available than ever before. Sometimes it takes a little bit of hunting to find a specific model and a road name, but patience and perseverance usually pay off. Used equipment can often be found on eBay, Facebook groups, and some local hobby stores. Another benefit of N-scale is portability. N-scale has the potential to provide modelers the ability to create easily transportable modules or layouts. The N-Track organization was pivotal in developing module construction standards, allowing modules from all across the world to be joined together, creating massive layouts in convention centers during train shows. These modules often would have trains of 100 cars or more, or something that was rarely done in HO or other scales. T-Track and N-Rail, all offshoots of N-Track, all promote modular railroading. Modern materials such as shelving, insulating foam, and other materials reduce the weight of any N-scale layout, and that said, the ability to create a detailed scene in as little as 1 foot by 4 foot can fit into almost any modeler's residence. Another benefit I see is that while some may say that N-scale is difficult to see or model details due to its smaller size, one could argue that you don't need to model what you can't see. Many modelers abide by the 3-foot rule. That is, if you can't see it from 3 feet away, it's not necessary to model it. That said, some modelers crave the challenge of super detailing their railroads, and this can be done. The amount of detail parts available in N-scale continues to increase. Additionally, the introduction of 3D printing in the past 5 years or so has provided many modelers with the ability to customize their scenes with one-of-a-kind items. While HO modelers have that same ability, the expense of creating those details is often more expensive than an N-scale. So to be fair, there are disadvantages to N-scale as well. As I mentioned, some people say that the N-scale is difficult to see, and as we get older, the eyes aren't as good. And working with small parts and details can be challenging, myself included. Being able to read road numbers on rail cars can be difficult. Kit parts are often small and sometimes hard to place on the model. Layouts that are built closer to eye level sometimes alleviate that to some extent. Secondly, while the supply of N-scale trains is better than it's ever been, HO still has an even wider variety. For example, the variety of steam engines available in N-scale is smaller than what's available in HO. Well, this may or may not be an issue for some people. If you're modeling the modern era, then that's not an issue. Another disadvantage, I would say, of N-scale is that while we have sound in our N-scale locomotives, while it's good, it's not as good as it is in HO. It's difficult to get that rumbling sound of the diesel that reverberates through your chest when operating. That said, a fair number of modelers don't really like the use of sound. So it's a balance. There have been numerous changes in the industry, even in the last 20 years. DCC has become extremely popular, especially with the addition of sound. 3D printing has become a hobby within a hobby. This has expanded the selection of details, buildings, and even locomotive and car shells. And the way people get their information about the hobby has increased with the internet, including special interest groups, Facebook, YouTube, eBay, etc. And the internet has opened the door to educating us through great modelers. There's all in a matter of a few clicks, and usually for free. It's definitely a great time to be in the hobby. In the end, the modeler must always make choices and compromises, regardless of scale. But don't worry, if you're modeling HO, S, or O, or any of the other scales, they aren't going away anytime soon. But if you haven't considered N-scale, check out my video on shelf layouts. Also, do a Google search or a YouTube search on N-scale model railroads and see what others have done. If you haven't looked at N-scale recently, I think you'll be surprised. So thanks again for watching another episode of 5-Minute Modeler, and I really would appreciate your comments in the comments section. I know this was maybe started out to be controversial, but it wasn't meant to be. But just changes that are happening in the hobby, and I think it's important to recognize those changes and understand what is going on. So again, thanks for watching, and have a great week.